welcome everybody as you join, and if you filled in the polls and introduced yourself in the chat box, thank you very much for doing that. Welcome to this webinar. Let me just introduce my organization, ProWash, a little bit. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ProWash, we're an initiative funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA, and led by Save the Children. At ProWash, we aim to provide support to implementing partners in order to strengthen the quality of WASH interventions through capacity strengthening, knowledge sharing, and applied WASH research opportunities. And to learn more, you can visit the FSN network by clicking on the link that we'll put in the chat box. Poll results have just come up, and these are interesting. Let me just go over these quickly. So the first poll: what level of familiarity do you have with O&M of WASH infrastructure? We have a majority of people, a small majority, saying that they occasionally work on O&M and understand the issues. The next biggest group is I work on O&M quite often and I'm familiar with it. 23% say they don't work on O&M at the moment, but they're interested in it, which is a good thing if you're joining this webinar. And only 18% say this is a major part of my work and I'm very familiar with it. The second poll, which is how important are financial issues in the overall sustainability of WASH infrastructure? Nearly all of the respondents, well, 59%, say about the same importance as other O&M issues like training, maintenance, or water quality. 41% say this is the most important part of O&M. And nobody has said it's usually not important or it's sometimes important. So this bodes very well for our webinar because this is the topic today. We're going to be talking about the financial sustainability of operation and maintenance and issues around that. If this is your interest, you've come to the right place this morning. As I've mentioned, please put your questions during the webinar into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box, which you'll also see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'd love to know who you are, what country you're from, and where you're calling in from. If you haven't already done so, please choose your language at the bottom of the Zoom screen, either English or French. We are offering simultaneous interpretation into French today. So welcome, and particularly welcome to those speakers, those Francophone speakers who are calling in today. It's great to have you with us. So welcome. If you're just joining now, it's really great to have you here. This is the third of our series of webinars on operation and maintenance of WASH infrastructure. And during this webinar series, we've been sharing lessons learned from USAID partners and other organizations focusing on innovative approaches to operation and maintenance of water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure. And our speakers have been discussing their programs' approaches to some of the engineering, environmental, financial, political economy challenges. And what we aim to do in this series is to draw out important lessons that are more widely applicable to O&M of WASH. And as I say, this is the third in the series, and we're excited to be hosting this one. Take a moment to look at the poll results, which have appeared on the screen in front of you if you've just joined, and you'll see in particular that the level of importance that's given to financial sustainability or financial issues in the overall sustainability of WASH is either at least as important as other O&M issues, or a substantial number of people, 41%, say this is the most important part of operation and maintenance. So welcome everyone. If you haven't yet done so, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Please remember that questions should be put in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those after the presentation. Please choose your language at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen, English or simultaneous interpretation into French. Welcome, everybody. Before we start, I think let me just run through one more time who I am. My name is Jude Cobbing, and I work for the ProWash Award at Save the Children. As I've mentioned, ProWash, we're an initiative funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and led by Save the Children, my organization Save the Children. And we aim to provide support to implementing partners to strengthen the quality of WASH interventions through capacity strengthening, knowledge sharing, and applied WASH research opportunities. If you'd like to know more about us or about the series, please click on the link to the FSN network, which you'll find in your chat box. So without further more ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Jim Gibson. Jim has 30 years of experience in water services. He has worked mainly in infrastructure creation and operations management. Jim has a BSc degree in mechanical engineering and is a registered professional construction project manager. Since October 2017, Jim has worked as a consultant using his extensive experience to provide technical assistance services to clients in Africa and further afield. For 15 years prior to that, he was a general manager and shareholder of a civil engineering consultancy firm. Earlier in his career, Jim spent 5 years managing a multidisciplinary rural development project for an NGO, which incidentally is where I met Jim. Jim has undertaken numerous assignments that have developed his respected audience, resulting in many invitations to facilitate and speak at local and international workshops, conferences, and seminars. His specific areas of expertise are infrastructure asset management, electromechanical equipment, operations planning and organization design and performance monitoring and benchmarking. Jim is also an associate of the ILC in the Netherlands. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Jude. Thanks for that introduction. So if we can have the first slide, please. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about, or mostly about, our experience in South Africa running a reasonably large set of rural water supply projects. The specific project that I will refer mostly to is experience we had in the Hani District Municipality as what is known as a support service agent. And then I'll follow up with some research that we've done in other countries that kind of gels with the learning and the experience that we had while doing the operation and maintenance in South Africa. And then obviously I'll summarize some of my thoughts at the end. Some of them might be contentious, but let's hope they lead to some fruitful questions and discussion. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of the development of water services in rural areas in South Africa. It doesn't by any means represent all of the major things that occurred, but I've selected a few to highlight that gel with what I'm talking about today. So pre-94, pre-universal democracy in South Africa, there were large backlogs in services, particularly in the rural areas, which were largely constituted of the former homelands, which was part of the apartheid planning. In 1994, a water and sanitation white paper was produced. In 96, our constitution guaranteed the right to water to everyone in the country, but did make the provision that this would be realized progressively. I think everyone thought it would happen reasonably quickly, but still to this day, there are projects ongoing that are trying to address the service delivery backlog, particularly in sanitation. Importantly, in 2001, powers and functions of water service authorities and water service providers were promulgated. These basically gave the roles and responsibilities to different institutions. And in South Africa's case, that was mostly municipalities that took on those two roles. We also have water boards that do bulk services, and there are various other forms of water services organizations. Norms and standards of supply in terms of proximity, water quality, and continuity were set in 2002. And then importantly, for this talk today. In 2003, the strategic framework for water services was published, and embodied in that document was this concept of free basic services for indigent households. And the reason that that was made a national policy was that some of the bigger cities in South Africa had demonstrated that it was possible to subsidize the water services to poorer households from the customer base, the more wealthy customer base that they had. And the feeling was that if these cities could do it, then based on the fiscal strength of the country, that this could be extended to all residents. And as I said, the concept of free basic services was put in place. Also embedded in this legislation was the idea right at the beginning that community-based management was what would be suitable for rural areas. But there was a recognition that this would probably not happen completely on its own. So they also provided for support service agents that would work with these communities that would be managing their own water supplies. Next slide, please. So this is what has transpired in terms of free basic services. This is an extract from the Division of Revenue Act that was published recently in February. So for this upcoming year, these are the amounts that are provided. And it's calculated based on the census figures. And each water service authority receives a subsidy for indigent households to the tune of $10 per month per household for water supply and $7.50. Obviously, those are a little bit rounded off. But as you can see, it's not an insubstantial amount of money that is allocated, and the water service authorities are the custodians of that. One comment is that from my side is that this is calculated on a per capita basis, but and I think the engineers in the room will probably agree with me that it's not necessarily the number of people that dictate your costs, but rather the nature of your infrastructure. And for example, groundwater versus surface water, and I'll come back to that later, and the various options of sanitation technology. But our Division of Revenue Act provides a universal number based on the population served rather than the infrastructure used. Next slide, please. So this is where we worked. This just gives you a little bit of an indication of the context that we were working in. In this particular municipality, it was originally split between the old South African Republic and the former homeland of the Transkei. So you can see on the leftmost picture, you can see all the villages in the east. Those were the rural areas. The next picture shows a little bit of a blow-up of one of the municipalities that we worked in. And each of those little polygons you see is an independent village that was under our care as a support service agent, with community-based operators and administrators working in each of those. And the colors represent the water quality at any given time, oh no, sorry, not at any given time, but rather on a particular month. And I'll come back to that, how we managed to create these spatially represented reports. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide to give you an indication of all of the things that we were involved with. While at face value, rural operation and maintenance may seem to be a very simple job, this just represents that there's a lot of things going on in terms of the core business processes of abstracting water and doing the various treatment and transmission processes to deliver to customers, and then the sewage and fecal sludge management activities that follow on from that. And then, of course, all of those support services that have to be provided to just make sure that things keep working. The next slide, please. So this was our scope of work in Chris Hani. We had 486 villages, 486 schemes. So some of them were regional schemes, some of them were group schemes, but the majority were standalone. 709 villages, as you saw in that previous picture. There were 8 towns, which were relatively small towns, but they were formal urban places. population of just under 400,000 people. And being an electromechanical engineer, I can't resist saying that 426 pump installations were part of our scope of work. And I think that that is an important consideration, which I'll come back to as well, just in terms of how that influences the work that's required, the skills that are needed, and the costs that will be incurred because of the nature of the infrastructure. We had quite a big staff, so at community level, we had that number of operators, administrators, and board members you see there. And on the right-hand side, this is just a very simple representation of our own organogram as the support service agent. And our workload did vary as various schemes came on board, but we had between 30 and 50 professional staff that supported the community-based operators, typically with high-level skills that are required. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of reporting that we put in place. This was very important from a management perspective to allow certainly myself to keep a finger on the pulse of what was actually going on. And we tried to align our reporting with the key norms and standards that I mentioned earlier that were set with in 2002. So we monitored the E. coli count in water, along with other quality parameters, but the E. coli count was, let me say, the most challenging, because this required us to make use of an accredited laboratory to do those tests. And so it became quite a big cost component of capturing the data or capturing the sample every month, which is one of the norms and standards that applies in villages that size, 1 per month sampling, sending it off to lab and getting the results back. We also had a system of monitoring the performance of the community-based organizations we were working with. As you saw previously, there were a large number of people involved. And so like any large grouping of people, it requires management. We couldn't just allow it to operate on its own. So we had performance standards, particularly the submission of reports that we required from these community-based organizations. It's probably important to mention at this point as well, as part of the free basic services, these community-based operators, administrators, and board members were in fact paid. They were part-time roles. We developed a system of assessing how many hours were required to do that work, and we used the minimum wages that were provided for in the construction industry charters year on year to determine how much the community-based operators should be paid. I believe that that's been adjusted recently to be more in line with certain public works programs that have been recently implemented. And then very importantly, we monitored the reliability of infrastructure through getting our local administrators to record which of the taps was mostly communal taps, which of them were working on any particular day. So every month we got a very good record of how many taps in a village were actually working. And this was really useful in determining our planning for our operation and maintenance activities. This data was then very simply emailed to a GIS consultant, and that GIS consultant took our simple Excel data and converted it into shapefiles and emailed us back within a few hours the maps that you saw previously, and we could ask them to give a spatial representation of any one of these parameters that we were reporting on, which became really useful in communicating to the management of the municipality and the politicians. Next slide, please. So this is what we achieved. We were quite proud of our achievement in Chris Hani. We achieved water quality compliance of 98%, and our continuity of supply was 96, which was, I think both of these were above the norms and standards that were set. As you can see, it was not quite so successful in Alfred Nzor District Municipality, ANDM, which is another area where we did a similar contract prior to Chris Hani. And our feeling was that the reason for the higher water quality in Chris Hani, so full marks to the hydrogeologists in the room, that it was largely groundwater supplies using electromechanical pumping systems. And Alfred was largely surface water, mountain springs running down from Lesotho in this particular case. But obviously it was much more difficult to control water quality in that instance. But over the years, we did introduce regular chlorination where problems were identified. Next slide, please. We also got involved in some interesting side studies. One of the big contentious questions was, should we be building regional schemes or standalone schemes? Which is more effective in delivering service? Which is more effective in terms of costs? And this was just a little survey. Well, it wasn't such a little survey, it was quite a big survey. But the interesting thing was that we found no compelling evidence that regional schemes provide a more reliable service. What we did find was that when people complained, regional schemes were more likely to receive attention because they obviously had a bigger political impact, if I can put it that way. And so they were more likely to be addressed when problems occurred, where standalone schemes often were neglected. Next slide, please. So this is just a way of representing the challenge we faced. Next slide, please. So we had a wide distribution of types of schemes. We had many small standalone schemes, which presented quite a logistical challenge. Many instances, there was no electrical power, so the pumps were powered by diesel generators or direct diesel engines. We had quite a few intermediate group schemes, and then we had a few high-tech regional schemes serving multiple villages, up to 100 in the one instance. And one of the challenges we faced, next slide please, was that you have to have quite a wide range of capabilities within an organization if this is the technical and logistical challenge that you face. And we were often asked what the solution would be to be able to address this. And although we did both of these, because that was the arrangement that was put in 2001 and 2005 on the two contracts, our feeling was that perhaps water boards, bulk suppliers, were more suited to the bigger high-tech schemes, but support service agent or municipalities would be able to handle and be more appropriately positioned to handle the logistical challenges of the many dispersed schemes. Next slide, please. So this is just a representation of the economies of scale that one might get if you go for regional schemes. But my own personal feeling is that one of the hidden costs of regional schemes is this question of complexity. And in water services, my feeling is that this doesn't reflect as increased costs in terms of money, but rather in terms of service delivery failure. So you saw our survey of the regional schemes, and in many cases, they had large areas that were dry almost permanently. And our contention was that it was complex to operate these, and you really needed a competent operator to ensure that the whole scheme was working at any given time. And that complexity is something that really needs careful consideration when you make the operational complexity. Is something that needs careful consideration when you make decisions around what size of regional scheme you might be considering building. The next slide, please. So this is the financial outcome. I've escalated these numbers to represent in 2021 dollars. And as it so happens, my vision was being blocked by one of the pop-ups. The current value of what it was costing us to deliver services in Chris Hani was $8.40 per household per month, sorry. And that should be per month. And in Alfred Nzo, it was $3.50. And so my comment here is that while the groundwater systems produced a better quality water, this is where the rubber hit the road in terms of costs. that it was much, much more expensive for us to maintain the groundwater systems because they typically required electromechanical equipment to pump the water, whereas the surface water schemes we had ran by gravity from reasonably close by high ground. Next slide, please. So there's just a representation of that. We did various cost modeling as an aside to this assignment, and you can see the yellow bars are actual costs. And this illustrates the relationship between the actual cost and the equitable share that was provided at that time. And in Alfred Nazor's case, the actual cost was much, much lower than the equitable share. Coming back to my earlier point that the costs are dictated by the nature of the infrastructure rather than necessarily just the number of people that are served. So if you have these schemes that have let me call a high density of electromechanical equipment, this requires higher skilled artisans, mechanics, electricians, and so on to actually keep them running, and therefore your operation and maintenance costs will be higher. So if you look on the right-hand side, there's a percentage representation of our different cost drivers. One of the very unpalatable things that no one likes to hear, but in rural water supply, you're usually talking about large distances. You saw that Chris Hani District Municipality is 36,000 square kilometers in size, and that transport cost is going to be a very big component of what you need to budget for. So surprisingly, you'll notice that the energy cost was very low as a percentage. Next slide, please. So as a result of all of this work, the one thing that came out of it was that we had to submit monthly fee accounts that detailed everything that we spent. And so we developed a very, very detailed database of what it actually costs to run these various schemes. And on the basis of that, we were asked by some other municipalities, including Chris Hani, to do some modeling of what it would cost for their whole service delivery responsibility. And what you see at the bottom there is our total cost estimates in both the instances of these municipalities exceeded both the equitable share, that is the grant funding from the central fiscus, and their tariff collection added together, which is quite disturbing because the equitable share is only supposed to provide for those that are indigent, and the rest should be made up for from tariffs that are collected. One of the other problems is that municipalities don't always allocate all of the money to water services that is allocated against that calculation that I showed earlier. But at the end of the day, they are municipalities, and they obviously want to behave like municipalities. But the reality is that many of these big district municipalities that run rural water supply in South Africa get maybe 80, in some cases even above 90% of their funding is related to water services, just by the nature of the powers and functions that they have. And therefore they are, in my opinion, de facto water utilities. But their mandate is as a municipality, and therefore they have to continue to provide those other services. And the only source of funding they have is from their water services equitable share. Next slide, please. So that's just a representation of the split of the costs that we had when we did it for other municipalities. You see in some of these instances, the community-based organization costs were very low just because of the nature of how they were doing it. But this, I just want to illustrate that the human resource costs are high because you have to have these highly skilled people to run high-tech equipment. And unfortunately, the nature of these pieces of equipment is that they do break down and they do require maintenance, and with disturbingly regular occurrence. This is the reality of operation and maintenance. It's relentless. The other thing that these graphs illustrate is this high plant and equipment cost, which is essentially that transport cost of keeping people on the move to be able to do the work where you have infrastructure that is dispersed over a large area. Next slide, please. So the finding from that was that even with these substantial subsidies that are available, it may still not be sufficient to run water services in these municipalities in South Africa that have inherited these areas that are the product of old apartheid planning. Our rural areas are where our greatest poverty exists, and it is indeed still a challenge even after 20 more years since 1994. The nature of the infrastructure and geography matter a lot. I think I've said enough about that. I won't belabor that point. And just to make the point that these cost drivers in rural areas can be quite different to what is normal in an urban environment. So taking urban experience and extrapolating that to rural areas, yes, if it's the only figures you've got, sure, you have to do that, but be very careful. They can lead to big discrepancies. And my warning would be, if any place or any country is considering free basic service, while it may be necessary, be careful in the decisions you make, and don't lock in mistakes that become difficult to undo. Some examples of that are when municipalities took over from the support service agents, probably between 2010 and 2015. Many of the community-based workers became permanent employees of the municipality, and that pushed their costs up dramatically. This question, if the money is allocated as it is in South Africa on an unconditional basis, the municipality can decide whatever they want to do with the money. If they are a municipality or a different kind of organization, it may not go directly to the service that it has been calculated in respect of. Yeah, and as I said earlier, some of these municipalities are de facto water service utilities, but because of the mandate they have, they will tend to take that money that is unconditional and allocate it elsewhere. Next slide, please. This was another side study we did on affordability. And one of the disturbing things that came out of this was that at the current level, this particular municipality, only 93% of households could not afford the tariff that was being applied at the time. On the right-hand side there, you see an illustration of the income distribution in South Africa, so the different municipalities. Sorry, the slide, can you go back one? Yeah, and just counterintuitively, because of the shape of that distribution of household incomes, lowering the tariff would actually result in an increased revenue for this municipality. Or let me not say lowering the tariff, a lower tariff could possibly have resulted in a higher revenue collection, because that graph that illustrates the income distribution is not directly correlated to a linear decrease in the value of the tariff itself. Next slide, please. So I'll quickly go through some experience we have when we compared some other experience in African countries. We looked at these various countries, and we asked questions around what operation and maintenance looked like, how it was done, and how successful it was. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all of these because they basically reiterate what I think I've been saying. But just to pick out a few, transport is a universal challenge in rural water supply. We have the problem that people make use of alternative sources, which obviously impacts on the revenue of utilities. And community-based organizations really need support to be able to perform any kind of meaningful role in ensuring the sustainability of rural water supplies. But in our experience, when we were doing it as a support service agent, that role of the community-based organizations was crucial to our success in that local activities are by far best carried out by local people as long as they have the technical skills to do so. And they play a very important part in being your eyes and ears to alert you when higher level maintenance activities might be required. Next slide, please. This was an interesting piece of work that we found as we did this research. These organizations that are represented here work largely in Central and East Africa. And the point of this slide is that in their funding model, they find that, as you see there on the bottom right slide picture, pretty much around 75% of their costs still have to be covered by outside sources, which is what was basically realized in South Africa in and around 2000, and hence the introduction of free basic services, that it was just not going to be commercially viable for these rural schemes. Next slide, please. This was some work we saw done in Mozambique. Again, I won't go through all of the points, but some key ones. Functionality was low, water quality was poor, but perceived to be safe. So often the aspect of the water service we provide where we think the value actually lies is not necessarily perceived to be so by the users. And again, they found that a large proportion of the society actually used alternative sources when they could. I think that's also a universal experience, that's what happens when alternatives are used that are perceived to be, let me not say free because there are other costs, but certainly don't require cash. Next slide, please. Again, just to reiterate the points, this was a summary of some work done by USAID, and it basically makes the same point that community-based organizations can't really be expected to fulfill this role all on their own. And we need to think beyond this community level and look to local government and national governments for the role that they can play. Next slide, please. So the big question for me is, what do we do if we have a service that has no fundamentally viable commercial proposition? And I think so much of the planning that is done in rural water supply has this as implicit. We seldom actually discuss it really. Although engineers and other project planners are asked to put in something about a financial plan, the truth is that it's never really given due consideration. And again, it's assumed that there is some sort of implicit viability. And I think the evidence certainly around Africa is that this is not the case. And in fact, not just around Africa. I mean, in many places, water supply does not have this commercially viable proposition. Next slide, please. So this is the way I like to represent it. If you have a challenge you face and your resources are far in excess of what the challenge presents, you don't have to think very hard. You can just dominate the challenge. And some countries in the world have this, where they have vast resources and they can just pay for what they need. In most places, good strategy and tactics are needed where your resources match the challenge more or less, and there you need good business practices. But in so many places, particularly in rural water supply, the challenge far outweighs the resources that are available. In a military context, that results in no option but to adopt guerrilla tactics. And I think the water services equivalent of that is what we call firefighting. And we see that all over. And I would propose that a big part of that is because the challenge just so far outweighs the resources that rural utilities have. Next slide, please. So this is my summary. O&M requires large resources. I think I've demonstrated that. In many rural contexts, the resources are unlikely to be provided from tariffs alone because of this non-viable trading proposition. A colleague of mine asked me recently if allocating the subsidies will guarantee that it will work. And of course, I can't guarantee that, but I would like to think that I can guarantee that it will almost certainly not work if the resources are not available. A controversial point on technical assistance, another illustration. If you look at a human being, no food for 3 weeks results in the person dying, no water for 3 days, and no air for 3 minutes. But if someone has been without food and water, food for 2 weeks, water for 2 days, and air for 2 minutes, what do you think is going to be their focus? So doing things that address the food and water shortage aren't going to help much when somebody is struggling for oxygen. Without adequate resourcing to do the job, the primary job that is at hand, many of the technical assistance initiatives that are undertaken are, of course, good in the long run, but it may not help these utilities in the short run and the challenge they face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was a really interesting talk, and I particularly like your analogy of WASH specialists as guerrilla fighters. It's certainly not one that's occurred to me, but I really like that. We have some great questions coming in from attendees, and can I remind anybody who still has a question, drop it in the Q&A box, and we will answer it. Any questions that we don't answer in this session, we will email to everybody. We will work with Jim to answer them after this session, and we'll email to everybody. So rest assured, all questions will be answered. Jim, the first question that we have here from Kevin Peterson is on the water quality issue in Alpha and Zor DM. You mentioned there was poor water quality. Was this a fecal water quality problem? What was the key issue there?
Yeah, so the first point is that this was, I'll have to dig into my memory because this was quite a long time ago. But as I recall, the water originally was not treated at all. And so it was a fecal problem, but because we knew the area and we knew where the sources were, it was unlikely that it was human contamination. But obviously these sources were out in very wild areas, and so it was presumed that it was animals. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's safe. I mean, there's been quite a lot written about, you know, the effect of the feces of young cows in causing disease in human beings. So that led to us implementing systems of chlorination at each of the reservoirs, which of course involved training community-based operators to do that and to monitor chlorine levels, which was a challenge in itself. But yeah, that was the reason for the E. coli contamination. It wasn't that it was high and pervasive, but it was high enough for us to be concerned about it, and hence the implementation of chlorination.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks very much. There's a few questions that I'll group together in the Q&A box around the model that applies in South Africa that might need a little bit of explanation around the community-based approach. From one questioner, what exactly were the steps followed there? And also, you were a support service agent, and could you just talk a little bit about who you were contracted to and what are the criteria for being awarded such a contract? So perhaps you could just expand a little bit on the particular hybrid model that applied in South Africa when you were working there.
Okay. So yeah, as I said, in 1994, the white paper on water and sanitation was produced, and very much the thinking was that rural water would be run by community-based organizations. But some people who drafted that legislation recognized that there would be limitations, and they put in place this concept of a support service agent. At that time, there was no funding available from the equitable share. So the notion of how that should be paid for was that the tariffs would be collected and that communities would engage with support service agents to assist them. And of course, that never happened. It was only with the introduction of equitable share where large amounts of money were given to the district municipalities, largely district municipalities, that had this responsibility as water service authorities. And they didn't have the capacity at the time. They looked around and contracted support service agents. So our contract was to the support to the municipality, and hence the very meticulous record keeping of costs, because we got paid on a time and cost basis. And then our proposal that we submitted, all of these all of the contracts were tendered, and there were many around the country. We participated in 2 of them. They weren't all tendered in the same way, but we participated in 2. We won those 2 tenders. And our proposal was that, essentially, to summarize it, that local tasks be undertaken by local people on a part-time basis. We developed work programs and job descriptions for those community-based operators. And then we provided a management structure for that to happen, a reporting structure, and put in place the necessary technical skills to deal with the more high-tech aspects of operation and maintenance, particularly electromechanical maintenance and repair.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say,
that...
I mean, I could go on for hours and hours and hours about the experience of this, and it has, and in fact, the experience in Alfred and Zor has been written up. If anybody's interested, if you Google around on the IRC website and using the keywords Alfred and Zor, you'll find a paper that was written probably around 2004, 2005 on how that particular contract was undertaken.
Thank you, Jim. And what I'll say is ProWash will get that paper and email it to all the attendees today. I could also talk about this for a long time, and thank you, Jim, for that answer. We have another question that's come in here linked to that, which is, was there a standard functionality checklist that you were required to use?
I'm gonna presume that means in terms of operation and maintenance, and not bidding for the projects. So
yes,
what we proposed was that we followed the norms and standards that had been promulgated as national as part of the norms and standards that are in the National Act. So water quality is defined in very particular terms in South Africa. And there's a national standard, so we attempted to adhere to that. The proximity of water was something that was dealt with in the construction phase, so we couldn't really do terribly much about that. And the continuity of supply is also, there are very distinct levels of continuity that are required, and that's why we implemented monitoring of things like the number of tap days, of operational tap days, so that we could report effectively on what continuity of service we were actually providing. Perhaps I can just make another comment there on this, is that, you know, most of these schemes were built on the basis of communal standpipes, but over the years there's been a large uptake of private connections funded by people in the villages themselves, and that has created quite a challenge in some instances, because as water becomes, as people have water closer to their homes, they obviously use more, and in some instances use it for small scale irrigation, and this has caused the technical failure of a number of schemes, because they just can't cope with that increase of demand as people bring water closer to their homes. So I think it's an important planning point. If you are going to plan for communal standpipes, at least think about what the consequences are if people implement private connections on their own.
Thanks, Jim. And in fact, that brings up another one of the questions, which is to do with the original 25 litres per person per day stipulation in South Africa. And one of the questions is this, if this consumption is exceeded, are there extra charges? And perhaps you could also just talk a little bit about the issue of tariffs and how they might relate to, you had a chart up there talking about the income distribution amongst recipients. So a little bit about the volumes and the costs and the tariffs, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, okay. I mean, again, a huge topic that one could talk for hours on. So I'll answer from the context of the project that's on the table here. So because of the equitable share, the strategy that was implemented by the municipalities was that in rural areas, people would not have to pay tariffs. And there was lots of debate about whether that was appropriate, because it should only be indigent families, indigent households that are subsidized through the equitable share. And another one of the side studies that we did while we were involved in this work was whether, the viability of collecting tariffs, when in remembering that these areas are the poverty-stricken areas of the country. So in any given village, there may be people that surely can afford the service, but given the distances and the technology of the time, it's important to remember that we started this in the days when cell phones were not ubiquitous. So we had to communicate through written notes taken by taxi drivers backwards and forwards. But tariffs were not expected from the rural areas. So that was the first part. Sorry, just remind me the second part of the question.
We're just talking about the volumes, the issue volumes, of yes. Do more volume, yes.
Yes, so we did do some monitoring of that, and what we saw was that if people have to carry water, the natural rationing that is implicit in having to carry water 200 meters resulted in households using about 2,000 liters a month. And people can do the mental arithmetic on a 5-person household, but it was very low levels of consumption. The other thing is that people would only use the water that came from the schemes for hygienic purposes, and often other activities such as doing laundry would be done using other water sources that were available. When people made private connections, we saw it revert to consumption levels that would be or adapt to levels that would be expected in urban settings. So typically around between 10 and 15 cubic meters per month per household. And
thanks, Jim. And
I mean, I didn't include. I have got some results from work we did on that. I didn't include them in this presentation, but that's the big problem. If the scheme is designed for 25 liters per capita per day, and people implement their own private connections, which is not anticipated, it requires big upgrades in the bulk infrastructure.
Understand. Thanks, Jim. And we've only got a couple of minutes to go, and I'd like to ask the million-dollar question that somebody has referred to already in the Q&A box, which is this whole issue of cross subsidies for rural water supply schemes. And you seem to be saying that in most incidences we do need some kind of cross subsidy. It's something that, as a commercial proposition, may not be entirely viable just for a particular rural area. Should we be thinking of cross subsidization as a bad thing, or is this a necessity?
Yeah. So I'm gonna answer as an operations manager / operations engineer, because I think there's a lot of that can be said from a financial, economic perspective and from a political perspective. But I come back to my point that, will it work if we apply the subsidy? I can't guarantee. But if you don't give me the resources as the operations manager to make things work, I can guarantee you that it won't. So I think what I'm not necessarily advocating for subsidies across the board, but what I would say is that there needs to be a realistic assessment of what the financial arrangements around any of these schemes might be. And at the same time, you have to, that financial assessment has to be based on some sort of operating strategy. For example, a very remote hand pump may not be best served by, weekly inspections. I mean, it may be that, like on the mines, when you have infrastructure that is difficult to maintain, it might be a run to failure strategy, but provision for very rapid response when failure does occur. So I think the answer to the question is, I'd like to see more realistic analysis of what is required, and then putting in place of the resources that the operations people really need to be able to do the work that's required.
And thank you, Jim. And you mentioned that, there's a kind of minimum level of electromechanical engineering cost and complexity that often goes with these things. What I'd like to say, though, as we close, Jim, thank you once again very much for this really interesting presentation. Everybody who didn't get their question answered in the Q&A box, rest assured it will be answered. And we'll be emailing that out to you along with some other resources after this webinar. You'll see as we close, there are 2 polls now in progress on your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you'd fill them in. The first is, what are your views on financial subsidies for WASH infrastructure O&M? And the second question is, did you find the content of this webinar relevant to your work? So if you wouldn't mind, as we go into the last minute or 2 of this operation and maintenance webinar, to fill in those polls that appear on your screen in front of you. And it's not too late, by the way, to put any further questions in the Q&A box. Today's speaker, Jim, will see those questions and will answer them, and we'll get those answers out to you. So please don't hesitate to put questions in the Q&A box still that might be occurring to you. As I say, please take a second just to fill in those polls, and we'll bring you the results just in a second. So we have here the first poll: what are your views on financial subsidies for WASH infrastructure O&M? Well, by far the biggest, 54% of people say that subsidies are essential for some WASH infrastructure. 11% say we should always avoid subsidies. 21% say temporary subsidies may sometimes be needed, and another small minority, 14%, say subsidies are always needed in the long run. The second poll result: did you find the content of this webinar relevant to your work? Split between 39% very relevant, 46% relevant, and only 14% said a little relevant. So thank you all very much for attending today. We really appreciate having you with us. Please don't forget, there's one last webinar in this series, which is on April 20th. Details will be on our website and in the chat box. Please attend. We'd love to see you there. It'll be showcasing a scheme in Bangladesh on reverse osmosis systems and successes there with a USAID project in Bangladesh. We'd love to have you at that. And with that, thank you all so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. It's been really great to have you here. Thanks once again to our speaker, Jim Gibson, and to my team at ProWash. And of course, in the background to Zach, who's been doing very able French interpretation as we've gone. Thank you all. We'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.